Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we dialogue with one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion, Roger Hallam, who we've had on Humanity Rising a couple times before, who was not only the founder of Extinction Rebellion, but you'll all remember in 2018, 2019, the mobilization that Extinction Rebellion transacted in Britain and around Europe and around the world was very highly publicized and had dramatic effects in all quarters. Since then, obviously, the world has been plagued with many other concerns in addition to climate. And in particular, we have the war in Ukraine, which has now essentially taken climate off the table as fossil fuels and the military-industrial complex take over the global agenda. And the situation around climate continues to worsen, but the attention of the world is now on war between the superpowers in Ukraine and escalating conflict with China. So, Roger, I want to welcome you to the program. Roger has a few constraints today on his end, so we're going to jump right in. First of all, Roger, just catch us up on what's been happening to you. I know you've spent some time in a British jail, if I understand it correctly, and would love to hear that story and what's been happening. And then out of that, we'll have a conversation about your sense of what is a strategic pathway for the movement, given the complexities of Ukraine, the climate situation, and world events. But first, just catch us up on your story.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, by the way, Jim, for having me on, and apologies, I'm only here for half an hour or so. Yes, well, as you know, Jim, and maybe some of your audience know, I'm not a sit behind the desk type. So we're trying to model a new form of leading from the front in Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain and the various other movements that I've taken a leading role in. I did go to prison for 4 months between November and April. And that was for making a speech supporting civil disobedience before a big action to close one of the biggest motorways in the UK. So I was arrested and assumed I'd be let out the following day because I wasn't involved in it. But they kept me on remand, which means, detained without trial for 4 months. And I'm in the process of trying to get the case dismissed against me. Because there's no evidence other than me making an act of speech, which, as Americans should know, is fundamental to democracy. So, unfortunately, in the UK, we don't have a constitution, and so the government can broadly do what it likes, and it is broadly doing what it likes, been arresting people for wearing T-shirts, going to non-violence trainings. The whole thing in the UK has moved into an authoritarian situation very rapidly over the last 12 months.
So
and that's
just for giving a speech.
Reality.
It was just for giving a speech.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to lead you. I'm not lying to you, okay? I'm not pretending there was something else. I was literally asked to do a 20-minute speech, which is a standard speech I've done hundreds of times, The climate crisis is here. Civil disobedience is the most effective mechanism to deal with it, and people should, take part in civil disobedience. And there was a upcoming series of actions, but I had no role in them. So it's going to be very difficult, of course, almost impossible for them to get it past a British jury. And I've been in court several times now where juries have found me not guilty. But the point here is the British regime, the carbon regime, obviously wants to intimidate people, and it does have this ability to bang people up for months on end without trial just because it thinks it can get away with it, which arguably it can.
That's amazing. So the 4 months that you were in the jail, you were released. Why and how? Was it a special court order, or are they just in the mysterious workings of?
Well, we haven't quite got into full authoritarian status in the UK. Obviously, there's authoritarian, right? And it's authoritarian in the sense they can just bang you in prison for months, but they can't keep you in indefinitely. So after a certain point, they decide to let you out. So that's what happened. But I think in those actions, there was 50 to 60 people who spent months in prison. So that's the biggest jailing of activists and campaigners since the Suffragettes over 100 years ago. So you can see that below the surface, the level of resistance in Western democracies is going up, from a structural point of view, and it's not going to stop because, as we all know, the crisis is getting exponentially worse. So there will be a point of reckoning, as there always is in history, where the powers of change will overcome the powers of reaction. But when that point will be, of course, is a matter of debate.
Yeah. And what has been the effect of those jailings of the 50, 60 people, including yourself, on Extinction Rebellion and the larger movement? I'm thinking too that even during the coronation of King Charles, people were rounded up for wearing T-shirts or carrying placards that were questioning the coronation in one way or another, and just rounded up, and they just disappeared and were released later. So this is something that the British government is clearly doing, not only against the climate activists, but just generally to suppress any kind of dissent against the prevailing narrative. But what's the effect of this on the movement?
You need to, as an analyst, as I am, strategic analyst, you have to understand the fundamental ambiguity of repression in a liberal democratic state, and arguably in other states. What I mean by that is repression has two identical outcomes at the same time. It dampens protest for the obvious reason that people are scared, and the consequences of sitting in the road now are a year in prison, for instance. So there's the traditional sort of left defeatist sort of analysis, which is, well, this is going to destroy social movements and all the rest of it. But then in the empirical record, there's actually a very different effect, which is due to two factors. The first factor is people get enormously enraged by injustice. And they say, if you're going to put me in prison, then so be it. And you can see this in the campaigns of Gandhi, for instance, and Martin Luther King. In fact, so this is what's called backfiring. If you try to repress people, as long as there's a degree of collective organization and rhetorical leadership, then people will just ignore it, and they'll say, okay, put me in prison for a year, because I'm not going to step down, because I won't be intimidated by you. The other thing is that if you're going to start putting people in prison for wearing a T-shirt in Britain, you're going to make yourself very unpopular. And so you have sympathy now from large parts of the general public, and particularly large parts of the liberal elites, who are not insignificant in terms of putting pressure on the government. So if you haven't got repression, in some ways, it's actually more difficult to make progress, if you see what I mean. So it's very complex. So I'm not saying for a minute that that guarantees a particular outcome. You mustn't fall into the idea that repression actually automatically leads to movements being crushed. That's simply, historically illiterate, as we know. So, for instance, I always tell Americans about American history. But I'm sure many of you know the reason why Martin Luther King, and his strategic colleagues chose Selma chose Birmingham for the Birmingham campaign was because of Bill Connor, right? They chose a city which had an appalling record of intimidation and violence.
Yeah.
And that was because they knew it would backfire and they'd get the sympathy of the American public. There was no guarantee, of course, but that was definitely a conscious strategic decision. And this has happened in Germany with a focus on Munich, which is like the Alabama of Germany, as you might say. So people have concentrated on Munich because the extreme conservatives there will, overreact. And they recently declared Last Generation a criminal organization and sent dozens of policemen with guns breaking down the doors of 20-year-old activists, dragging them off. And it's totally backfired. And they've raised hundreds of thousands of euros. And, many public commentators said this is totally ridiculous. And that this is how they're going to win, by exposing the implicit violence of the system for explicit violence, which is, the methodology of the non-violent tradition we're in.
Right. So your sense is that the movement has actually paradoxically been deepened and in some ways consolidated, given the upscaling of the repression by the British government. So that's your sense of
yes, and also
right
by
now.
The British press. So I'll just give you a little example. Is the British right-wing press, as you may know, is particularly vicious, and they attacked someone who had given money to us, in public. And this person who'd given money to us is a public businessman. He refused to back down, and he said, well, I'm not going to be intimidated by you. I will double the money that people give to Just Stop Oil. And in 2 days, we raised £300,000 because people admire individuals that stand up to bullying and intimidation. And obviously, it's a risky thing to do, but it's a necessary thing to do. And then we asked Adam McKay, from America, director of Don't Look Up, to triple the money and not to be intimidated by the right-wing press. And people were saying, well, I'm not quite sure about Just Stop Oil, but I hate the right-wing press to donate. So you see how that works. And we managed to raise almost £1 million, like, $1.2 million in a week. And this is for a civil resistance organization, right? That's never happened in the last 100 years. But you've got that level of support for an organization that's involved in systematic civil disobedience campaigns. So, there's everything to play for.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, even here in the United States, the repressive regime of Governor DeSantis in Florida, for example, which was getting worse and worse, has spawned all kinds of local oppositions, and particularly the Gen Zs are kind of coming out swinging all over the United States, and in very dramatic ways, like in Tennessee, with young Black state legislators that are coming up. So I think you're right. I think there's a sort of a critical mass of rage and opposition that is beginning to be catalyzed, and I applaud you for being able to raise that much money in that short a period of time, and for the courage of the business executives, and for all the people that are paying attention enough to know that that's an issue that they have to deal with. So you must be then ready for the next phase. How are you?
Yes, and I think what I want to say is what we have to understand is when the conservative right overplays its hand, it will provoke mobilization amongst progressive people, amongst or even ordinary people who just feel it's gone too far, as you might say. But the real challenge here is to create a solid organizational framework for resistance to happen. And the biggest weakness in the US is the inability to create sustained civil disobedience organizations along the lines of what the gay liberation movement had, the civil rights movement, the trade union movement in decades past. And what I spend a lot of my time doing is trying to encourage this pragmatic, let's just get down and get on with the job culture that we have in Germany and France and the UK, to reintroduce that into the US. Because paradoxically, everyone in Europe learned their trade, as it were, from America, because America was the center of the civil disobedience world, right, coming out of Martin Luther King and various liberation movements. So what we're hoping to say to the US, and we're getting there, I think now, is focus pragmatically on good organization, right? People respecting each other, focusing on the job, getting things done, and then reaching out to ordinary people so you're not staying in the bubble. So it's good organization, reaching out to people. And this means debating the opposition, going into the opposition spaces and standing there and speaking and being there while they attack you, because that exposes their cowardly, reactionary orientation. And I can't emphasize this enough, that social change comes through fearlessness, right? Leadership that is fearless. And by that, I don't mean you don't feel fear. I'm an ordinary guy, but as there's that definition of courage, courage is the decision not to give in to your fears, right? So I was obviously frightened of going to prison, but I was totally prepared to go to prison. I was quite calm about it because I knew that that was necessary at this stage in history. And that's what we need to give each other and support each other, is to say, this is what is now necessary, just as it was, in our parents' time and our grandparents' time, in order to preserve equality and liberty and these fundamental values of democracy. We do need to now step up into mass civil disobedience. And if we don't, we know what's going to happen, don't we? Which I think we're coming on to.
Yeah. Well, that leads us to the other domain I wanted to just explore with you, just to get your perspective on what's going on. Because as I said in my introduction, after 2018, 2019, there was this glimmer of kind of hope that the climate issue would be sufficiently in the public collective consciousness that we could mobilize government action. Obviously, it failed at the COPs, and there was consternation. And then all of a sudden, starting in 2022, is the war in Ukraine, and all of a sudden, the gas pipeline is blown up, and gas and fossil fuels are urgently needed in Europe and the United States, which blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, now is selling gas and oil to Europe in unprecedented ways and extortionate prices and so forth. So you have an upending of the energy economy, shall we say, particularly in Europe, but also with reverberations around the world. And right at the moment when we need to be actively collaborating with the Russians and the Chinese, we're mobilizing for war in Ukraine with a possible nuclear war. And so given this new ingredient in the geostrategic reality, particularly in Europe, which is just lockstep now with the US war machine, how are you understanding that situation, and what's your counsel strategically for the climate movement moving through this? You take the Green Party, for example, in Germany, and it's completely pro-war. And
Well, we need to learn from history. I mean, I'm listening to
tell us
a podcast about World War I and the revolutions that came during and after World War I. And you can see a similar pattern in history over and over again, over the last 250 years, which is when the ruling class overreaches itself. And that, what I mean by that is engages in war. What you have in the system is an enormous amount of turbulence. So by turbulence, what I mean is a lot of terrible things happen. Lots of people get killed and all the rest of it. And at the same time, people gain the existential courage to actually wish to bring about a new form of society, right? So for instance, like after the Second World War, the British people gained the courage to create a social democratic welfare state, which was by no means obvious before 1939. So I think what we need to look out for is the countercurrents of popular mobilization, which will come from the suicidal disregard for our common interest by Western ruling classes. And obviously that's what we're seeing over and over again. We're seeing it with the grotesque betrayal of Biden on his promises to reduce emissions. We're seeing it with the Labour Party in the UK rolling back on its commitment to create a green economy. We're seeing it in Germany with the capitulation of the Green Party to, the logic of maintaining the economic system. And we know maintaining the economic system is a suicide message to people under 30, right? So people under 30 are soon going to get the message, and are increasingly getting the message, that the very system itself is fundamentally suicidal. It's fundamentally murderous, just as it was in various points in history, right? And what that provokes is, to not put too clear a word on it, revolutionary episodes, uprising episodes. And those episodes come out of nowhere, as we know. No one predicts them. Both you and me are old enough to remember 1989, right? We're all sitting there thinking the Soviet Union is going to be there forever. And suddenly, out of nowhere, it all collapses.
Exactly.
Remember 2012, commentators coming on saying there's no way there's going to be a revolution in Egypt. Oh, and suddenly there is, right? In the First World War, no one thought that Russia was going to collapse. This happens over and over and over again. So what we need to look out for is the potentiality, and organize for the potentiality of tens of thousands of young people coming out on the street, possibly provoked by the death or injury of other young people because of state repression, and that becoming a tsunami of progressive civil resistance. And that is definitely going to happen. And again, for us as leaders and designers in the space, we have to prepare for that and make sure that those moments are translated into the formalization of progressive power. That sounds obviously ridiculous to most conventional commentators because they can't conceive of uprisings happening in Western democracies. But I can tell you, right, I'm an analyst, I've studied history, that's my job. To my mind, this is now inevitable because of the, contradictions in the carbon state. We're definitely going over 1.5 degrees. We're almost certainly going over 2. The Arctic's going to melt. All the temperatures are off the record. It's only a matter of time before there's ecological disasters that involve the death of millions of people. When that happens, you will almost certainly see uprising events around the world. And what we have to remember is that those events are rapidly transferred from one country to another. You saw that in 2012, we've got this little problem in Tunisia. Within 3 months, there's 5 or 6 major rebellions in different Near Eastern states. As I said, probably me and you remember sitting there thinking, oh, there's a bit of a problem in Poland. Oh, there's a bit of a problem in East Germany. And suddenly within 3 months, we're just like, our eyes are popping out going, the whole bloody thing's collapsed, right? This is what's going to happen in Western democracies because we have to have faith in our long traditions of democratic, determined culture. People in Western societies, they can put up with a certain amount, but they will not put up with genocidal, suicidal policies that start to manifest themselves, right? You know, there's no absolute guarantee here, by the way, but you shouldn't underestimate the backfiring effect of the stupidity of our elites.
Well, I hope you don't get put in prison again for saying what you just said, which is probably what you said to the group that you were speaking to, because I think this is powerful, powerful stuff, Roger, powerful.
Well, you should know that, unfortunately, you will only ever see me on Zoom, because I think the days when I could come to America are long gone. So I am looking forward to the revolution, and for selfish reasons, I might finally be able to come to America and say hello to you all. But in the meantime, we're restricted to revolutionary talk over Zoom. So that's the state of play.
Yes, well, I know you need to go, and I want to honor that, but I want to thank you for your clarity, and thank you for your courage, and just welcome you to say any final words you would like to say to our global community before.
Well, as you know, like, I'm an intensely practical guy, and everyone has to be involved in civil disobedience at this point in history, you know, both strategically and morally. We're not going to be able to live with ourselves if in 10 years' time you look back at this period of history and go, I didn't do what I could. And we shouldn't underestimate the determinism of that level of guilt. You know, we have a big psychological literature which points to people feeling enormous levels of guilt involuntarily if they don't make a moral stand at a time they should have made a moral stand, either in their personal lives or in their public lives. So it's essential people look in the mirror and go, this is the time when I need to step up and join civil disobedience movements, which we all know is the only way to create rapid change at this point in history. So to that end, the Declare Emergency campaign that I work with will be sitting in roads and what have you in Washington, DC, to force Biden to declare a climate emergency. There's going to be another iteration in August. So maybe you can put some information on that so people can contact that organization. There's a bunch of, you know, there's another 4 or 5 organizations in the States, as you may be aware. And then the good news is, once that iteration is happening, we're hoping to put together the funding and the organizational activists to do mass civil disobedience in DC and maybe other cities. So we will be up to, you know, the American standard of historic resistance to evil that your great country has shown us in the past. But yeah, that is the serious situation. And yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And apologies again, I've got to rush off. Thanks.
Roger Hallam, everyone, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, and ever active and now focused on the essential task of civil disobedience against the prevailing policies around climate change. So thank you so much, Roger, and we wish you all the best. And we'll have you on again, maybe in the fall, to give us an update on.
Yeah, and I'll try and make sure I'm on for longer and can rant on for a bit more. Anyway, right. Good luck, everyone. Lots of love. Bye.
Be well. Much to ponder with what Roger just said. I wonder whether this might be a good time to just pause and breathe together. I don't know whether Georg's with us and can put the sounds for us. But if not, let us just take a moment and just take in what Roger just said, that we're at a suicidal moment with climate change, and now with the complication of war. And the only thing that's going to stop it is if people come out into the streets and use their bodies to disrupt business as usual until there's an ignition sufficient to change the course of our downward spiral. That's a very stark message, but that's what we've just heard from one of the great strategists for social movements of our time, Roger Hallam. So let's just take a moment and just breathe. Thank you, everyone. I think we may have come to our close for today. This will be a shorter session. I would just add a few comments of my own as we continue to reflect on this very, very powerful message from Roger. Many of you may know I have my own experience in civil disobedience. When I was young and studying at graduate school and coming out of the Vietnam War, where age 18, I refused to cooperate with the US government and refused to take a physical. That was my first act of civil disobedience. And that nearly got me into prison. But I avoided that. And then with the anti-nuclear movement in the 1970s and 1980s, I was there at various nuclear power plants around the clamshell alliance and the Seabrook nuclear reactor up in Boston while I was studying at Harvard, and then working on the Karen Silkwood case with Danny Sheehan and others, and organizing civil disobedience against the Black Fox nuclear reactor in Oklahoma, outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which ended up being the largest civil disobedience action in the history of the Southwest. Nearly 600 people going over the fences, including women and children, and facing down police guns. It was an extraordinary moment. Also at the Pentagon, with the mobilization for survival and helping to coordinate the nonviolent civil disobedience at the Pentagon against the climate policies of the US government and against the wars that are perpetually in motion, initiated by the United States, and other actions, even against apartheid, back at Harvard, where we took over the administration building over trying to get Harvard to divest from South Africa until South Africa stopped apartheid. So this whole nexus point around social change, where one realizes it's time to move from speaking and seeking to convince to actually using your body in the spirit of Gandhi and Martin Luther King to put your body down in solidarity with others, is an extraordinary moment in one's lifetime. And your consciousness is really changed forever when you understand that your body is both belongs to you, but also belongs to the collective. And you can use your body for the purposes of social justice, as Roger is. And that's a very powerful statement. There's no more powerful statement than someone who's willing to put his body in alignment with his beliefs. And it reminds you of Martin Luther King, the young monk back in 1517, hauled up before the Pope for nailing the 95 Theses on the church wall there in Worms, Germany, and finally saying, "Here I stand. I can do no other." And on that courage and on that strength, European history was changed because of the ignition of the Reformation. And so there are many people over time who have stood up, as Roger is, and made the clarion call that it is time for us to put our bodies down because of the urgency of the situation. And within this context, I think it's very important just to add one more comment, and that is what Martin Luther King observed about civil disobedience, of the problem. The purpose of civil disobedience is to call attention to the problem so that an aware public can convey the message with pressure, largely through their willingness to suffer. Roger went to prison for 4 months. He suffered, I'm sure, a lot, as did his family and his community. So did Martin Luther King. So did Gandhi. Many were beaten. Many were shot. Many were killed. But they just kept on keeping on. When one thinks of the civil rights movement under the leadership of Martin Luther King going directly into Birmingham with Bull Connor, if you remember that history, that sheriff was committed to apartheid, committed to segregation, and had big police dogs, German shepherds, that had been trained as attack dogs. So when those young Black men and women, stood up and walked those streets, they knew they were going into a real maelstrom of violence. And that's what it took. And of course, out of that came the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and major legislation, but including the assassinations of not only Martin Luther King, but Malcolm X and dozens and hundreds of other Black people that were killed in that process and maimed and permanently injured, both psychologically and physically. But they called attention to the crisis. And if you think about what's happening right now, not only is climate change is slipping off the table, but as we're mobilizing toward more war between the United States and Russia and the United States and China, what are we doing in the face of that? They've just moved tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus. And the president of Belarus, just over the last couple of days, tactical nuclear weapons that the president of the country, Lukashenko, said are 3 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb, what was dropped on Nagasaki. It wiped out hundreds of thousands of people, incinerated them. It made the entire regions uninhabitable for decades. And so we need to think about what we're going to do in this moment. We're in a moment like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where we need to take in that the United States and NATO and Russia are now actively thinking about the use of nuclear weapons in Europe. What are we all going to do about it? Are we going to continue to support the war? We see that the climate agenda is no longer even on the table, and fossil fuels are being used in a resurgent way. How are we going to respond to that? Do we just wring our hands and not watch the news anymore? Do we participate in this counterforce that Roger is talking about when we're in a moment where somebody needs to find a pathway to peace? We're in a John Kennedy moment. If you've looked at the movie 13 Days or familiarized yourself with the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were 13 days in October 1962 where both sides, the military and the bureaucracies on both sides, were recommending going to first strike nuclear war. And John Kennedy and his brother Bobby had to find a pathway to peace when everyone was saying that was not viable. And when Adlai Stevenson, the US ambassador to the United Nations, suggested that there be some kind of a diplomatic agreement such that the Soviets, the Russians, would withdraw their missiles from Cuba in exchange for the United States withdrawing missiles from Turkey, he was reviled in the meetings by the military. But finally, the Kennedys were able to negotiate a pathway to peace, but we almost went to nuclear war. And had we done so, most of Europe and North America and the Eurasian landmass would still be radioactive wasteland, because the amount of nuclear weapons that would have been used would have been times Hiroshima and Nagasaki 1,000-fold. What a waste that would have been. What a tragedy. And what a nobility for John Kennedy to negotiate his way through that crisis. And out of that, as you all may remember, came the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. A year later, it was the first treaty signed between the Soviet Union, the Russians, and the Americans to stop nuclear testing. And then there was a series of treaties, and all those treaties now have been disbanded, including the treaty banning medium-range and short-range missiles in Europe. So when you think about the tactical nukes going into Belarus, they can get to Berlin in less than 60 seconds. And that's why they were banned in the 1980s with Gorbachev and Reagan and Bush Sr., because they understood that if you put tactical nuclear weapons into Europe, there's no response time. You're dealing with seconds. So the only real option is first strike. And we're now in that moment, and all of us, as Roger is asking us, need to take in the gravity of what we're in, and the fact that because of the war, the climate situation is getting worse and worse, because what we need to deal with climate is the cooperation between the Americans and the Russians and the Americans and the Chinese. And instead, we're splitting the world apart. And right at the moment, we need urgent, unprecedented collaboration. The superpowers are going to nuclear war. They're already in war in Ukraine, with an escalating possibility of a nuclear exchange. And also with China, with increasing predictions of war with China. That's an extraordinary moment in human history. And how we understand that and how we deal with it collectively. We try to raise these issues with Humanity Rising. We try to bring in people like Roger Hallam and frontline workers. And as you know, there's multiple code red issues now that all of us are dealing with in one way or another. And That is the purpose of Humanity Rising, is to promote people on the front lines. Next week, we're going to be having a whole week on artificial intelligence as we think about the extraordinary implications of what that means. And then the following week on China, it will be our first major program on China, really looking at this escalating conflict with China. And what do we do about it? How do we take it in? How do we pressure in any way that we can the powers that be that seem hell-bent on a self-destructive path at a moment when we need urgent global collaboration across the board? So as Roger said, it's actually a potentially suicidal moment for humanity. And it's happening right on the news every day. And we have to take it in, and we have to somehow process it collectively, coherently, and take actions that are prudent to us. And it may be that not everybody can be on the streets, but it is a situation, if you're in a Cuban Missile Crisis situation, where now all of us need to take in that the use of nuclear weapons is now being actively considered in Europe. We haven't had that situation since 1962. So that should be in all of our consciousness now. And we need to look it right in the eye and not turn away. We need to pray for Joe Biden. He's the one person that could make a difference right now, just like John Kennedy made the difference back in 1962, when in the face of all the pressure to go to a first strike nuclear capability and invade Cuba and wipe out those Russian missiles, he resisted and found a pathway with Khrushchev to bring about the peace and the first nuclear treaty. What would it take to get that pathway going right now? Where is the pressure point? Who would stand up among the politicians and propose the most obvious thing in the world, a ceasefire and a summit? The Russians and the Americans have been competitive and the Cold War for decades, and they had a series of summits because the leaders had a good enough sense to create pathways to peace. And we need that now, urgently. And that's one reason why we had Roger on today. And I'm very sorry that he couldn't stay with us longer. He'll be back. I hope his views and my commentary, sobering as they've been, will help share illumination to us. So with blessings, everyone, I'll bring this now to a close. And thank you for listening, and thank you for your support for Humanity Rising. I'm deeply grateful, just personally, to be able to share this space with you day in and day out, because it is a source of solace. And I would close with just one more point about the importance of breathing. The coherence breathing that we do every day, I do probably 20 or 30 minutes every day. Just breathe in for the count of 5, breathe out to the count of 5. It brings coherence. We're in such a maelstrom of centrifugal force right now. Our stresses, our anxieties, the trauma that we're seeing all over the world that we internalize when we watch it in the news. We're all suffering from headline trauma syndrome, as has been discussed in our programs before. So when we breathe together, when I do the coherence breathing, just bear in mind that you're doing the kind of breathing that modern science and ancient mysticism has said is the single most effective and immediate way to bring coherence to your whole being. The more you breathe coherently right now, the more you're able to experience and maintain calm. And the greater the centrifugal chaos, the more all of us have to generate internal coherence. So I would just urge you personally to breathe coherently as much as you can during the day. When you take your walks, when you have a few minutes, just breathe. Just breathe in and breathe out. And that just gives you fortitude for processing everything that we have to process now as aware human beings. It's a form of self-love. We can only love others to the degree that we love ourselves. That's the deepest truth of the spiritual path. So the more self-loving we can do and the more coherence we can integrate into our being, the more we can be of service to humankind. So thank you, everyone. I deeply appreciate all of you. You're all welcome to the after session chat. Stan will put this link in the chat box just in. And then tomorrow we're going to be going to England again and listening to one of the seers, a woman who is writing a novel on a utopian vision of the future. A better world is possible. We just are the gateway and the pathway. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.